Hello, everyone. Welcome to Conservation International's People Need Nature discussion series. We're delighted to have you with us today for a conversation about the ways we can protect the global economy by protecting nature. We're delighted to see so many old and new friends could join us for the call today. My name is Judy Agnew, and I work with Conservation International supporters here on the West Coast. Before we get to our featured speakers, I have a few housekeeping items. When you join the call, you are muted and your webcam is turned off. It will be off for the duration of the call. We will have time for questions and answers after the conversation. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so on the question pull down bar. Oh, there you go, you can see the picture on the GoToWebinar control panel. We have a team standing by reviewing your questions, and we will try to get to every single one of them as well as we can at the end of the conversation. In addition, if you'd like to expand the screen of the conversation, you can go to the upper right-hand corner of the GoToWebinar screen. And finally, we will be recording this event, and it will be available on Conservation International's website. Now, I would like to introduce Dr. M. Sanjayan, Chief Executive Officer of Conservation International.
Great, thank you, Judy, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm actually here in our Arlington Global Center. It's one of my first times back into the office. We have our leadership team meeting here, and we took the decision to try and do the leadership team meeting mostly in person. It was a very exciting morning, and it was just really nice to see everyone, even though I didn't really fully see them because it was kind of mostly like this. But here I am in a closed conference room, and I'm just here on my own. So I've dispensed with the mask. Really excited to have this conversation today. Tom Lovejoy, Dr. Tom Lovejoy, has really kind of been in my life for my entire sort of working adult life in one way, shape, or form. I've known of him, I've written to him. He's been an unbelievable mentor, a friend, the most inviting, thoughtful, kind, brilliant person that I have in some ways in my life, and I've really grown to really appreciate all that he does for Conservation International and for many other organizations as well. Of course, he's an accomplished conservation biologist, and he's a member of Conservation International's Leadership Council. He's the founder and president of the nonprofit Amazon Biodiversity Center, ABC, pretty easy to remember, and the renowned biological dynamics of forest fragmentation projects. The first way I really got to know about him because he was doing this big project when I was a grad student in the Amazon around forest fragments. You know, what happens to biodiversity when the Amazon becomes fragmented? It had huge implications to how you design a national park, how you think about island conservation, how you think about connectivities, all things that I was obviously interested in. In 2010, he was elected as a professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at George Mason University nearby. He's a senior fellow at the United Nations Foundation in Washington, D.C. And his career has spanned the political spectrum. He served as a science and environmental advisor under Presidents Reagan, Bush, and President Clinton. Many key influential positions, including sort of being the chief biodiversity advisor, the chief of biodiversity. I don't know the exact title at the World Bank when I was a lowly intern there. He brought international attention to the world's tropical rainforests, in particular in the Brazilian Amazon, where he's been working since 1965, and developed the idea behind the debt for nature swap, something that many conservation organizations, including the one I used to work for, the Nature Conservancy, and the one that I am now helping to lead, Conservation International, has made part of their raison d'etre. In fact, the very first thing that CI ever did as a brand new organization 30, 35 years ago was a debt for nature swap that it helped do, I think, in Bolivia at the time. His graduate degrees are from Yale University. So long introduction, very sorry about that. Tom, Dr. Lovejoy, great to have you here. So can we just jump in to something I've always wanted to ask you about? You always talk about a place called Camp 41, and some people who know you and people who are very lucky get invited to Camp 41. You've invited me there before. I've said no, thinking that, well, listen, it's a quick plane flight away. And boy, am I regretting it now. What would it be like to be at Camp 41? Why is this place in the Brazilian Amazon so important to you?
So Camp 41 is one of a series of camps we have for the Forest Fragments Project. But I think to really answer your question, you go up the highway from Manaus 2 or 3 hours, then you turn off on a side road, which is in terrible condition, and you go 41 kilometers, which is why it's called Camp 41. And then you walk down a trail for maybe half a mile. And it's pristine Amazon forest. It's unbroken forest all the way from there to the Guianas. So everything that's in the ideal Amazon forest is there, including jaguars, who you never see, but they see you. And then you emerge into this clearing, and there it is, set up for students and visitors. And then I have people stay there for like 3 days when I can do it right. And we do walks in the forest and all the rest. And you see the moisture come out of the top of the forest after a rainstorm, so you can see the hydrological cycle of the Amazon. You sleep in hammocks, and you listen to the forest all day long and all day night, or all night. And it has never failed to sort of get across to people in their very gut that we live on a living planet. That's how we should both think and behave.
You know, you were one of the people who really brought the word biodiversity to life. I'd say you and E.O. Wilson, that's where I heard those words, biological diversity. It must be that experience that kind of helped open your eyes to this world dripping with biodiversity, this cathedral of life idea.
Well, it's very interesting. So I was obsessed with the variety of life on Earth from about the age of 14, and have never been able to get enough of it. But you know, the Amazon forest is, for biologists, it's like being inside a Christmas stocking that has no end to it. It's always full of things that are new and surprising and fascinating.
When you think about the Amazon, and I've spent a little time in the Amazon, mostly in the Ecuadorian part of the Amazon, Brazil too, but mostly in Ecuador, in places like Yasuni National Park and that side of the equation, it seems remarkably permanent, and it seems very old, and it seems like everything is working and ticking like a meticulous, high precision clock. And yet there's a new idea that is out there that you have helped push, that the Amazon, the world's largest tropical rainforest, the lungs of the planet, if you will, is close to a tipping point. That when the change comes, it doesn't come gradually, it comes gradually and then suddenly. Can you explain a little bit about where that idea comes from? And it seems unbelievable if you're there and you see how big it is and how permanent it feels.
So people had, for centuries, made that observation of moisture coming up out of the top of the forest canopy after a rainfall. But it was only in the 1970s that a Brazilian scientist, Enéas Salati, actually examined isotopes of oxygen and rainwater from the Atlantic to the Peruvian border and demonstrated unequivocally that the Amazon made half of its own rainfall. And that's because of the transpiration through the leaves and evaporation off the complex surfaces of the forest. And that shattered the paradigm, which had been that vegetation is simply the consequence of climate, has no influence on it whatsoever. So when Enéas published that paper, I would say deforestation in the Amazon in the mid-70s was probably 6-7%, maybe not even that high. But there was this question that he and I used to discuss, which is how much deforestation could cause that hydrological cycle to degrade to the point that there would not be enough rain for a rainforest to grow. And obviously that number was going to be way far off, beyond where we are with deforestation even now. But what has confounded it is two other factors, climate change and excessive use of fire, interacting negatively with the hydrological cycle. So Carlos Nobre, the Brazilian climate guru, and I have been talking about this for a long time and concluded a couple of years ago that we're actually pretty close to the tipping point right now, around 20% deforestation. And you can see it in unprecedented droughts every 5 years or so. You can see it in the dry season being longer by a month in the southern Amazon, change in tree species composition. And so the most vulnerable part here to the tipping would be the southern and eastern Amazon. You wouldn't lose the entire Amazon, but you'd certainly lose the south and the east, and it would have major impacts on the moisture of every country in South America except Chile. So it's part of the continental climate system.
Right.
The good news is if we collectively act soon, we can build back through reforestation a margin of safety.
So the notion, and one of the drivers, the one you're highlighting here, is that the rain-making capacity of this system. And once we tinker with it, and once it pushes beyond a certain point, it fails, and that creates a cataclysm of other things. Now, clearly, that would have a huge impact negatively on the global economy, and certainly in the economies of the Americas that depend on agriculture and river transportation and everything else you see, and fires, of course, that are burning now, even as we speak. You've been a proponent of the idea that protecting nature is a win in terms of the economy, that it isn't at the cost of the economy, that the old sort of the dichotomy, like most dichotomies, is false, that it's either the economy or the environment. And there's a big idea out there now that talks about protecting at least 30% of the planet, 30% of nature, 30 by 30, other ideas similar to that, half Earth that Ed Wilson and others have pushed. Can you articulate that link in more broad terms? How does protecting nature at that kind of scale really help the economy, and particularly the economy of the future?
So the really interesting thing about all of this is I think most of the economic analyses that has led to all the destruction of nature has actually been just very poorly done and ignored a lot of benefits that standing nature has for us. So the UK Treasury has commissioned a report on the economics of biodiversity, being led by Partha Dasgupta at Cambridge. It's intended to be the biodiversity equivalent of the Stern report on climate change. And it will make the point extremely forcefully that ecosystem services are a serious benefit that we get from standing nature, and that we ignore that valuation to our long-term peril.
But hold on. I'm going to press you on this. So when you say, so I've heard the word ecosystem services, of course, but do you think the reason why that message isn't sinking is because we cannot trace cause and effect tightly, that the linkages are still murky, that we're not monitoring it right? Why is it that we don't fully understand and incorporate that the link? So you lose this forest, you lose this grassland. Here's what it's doing to the soil. Here's what it's doing to pollinators. Here's what it's doing to the economy.
So I think the answer to that is we only understand it in part. But what we do understand, if it was implemented on a regular basis in economic analysis, would lead us to be much more respectful of nature, whether it's marine nature or it's the watershed of New York City or the largest urban forest in the world in Rio de Janeiro. I think there's a problem about being a social primate that we tend to get stuck on each other and our own little creations, you know, as I like to say, in social grooming, while the environmental lion sneaks up.
Right, we're busy grooming each other.
Right.
Fair enough. So let me ask you this. So you say there's some very serious people at Cambridge, sort of the Stern report equivalent, where we are going to have good data that shows that losing nature is hugely detrimental to our economy. The corollary is also true. Protecting nature can add to economic well-being.
Well, that's absolutely true. And I mean, you could take the hackneyed example of the New York City watershed, where restoring the watershed protected the water quality at a tenth the cost that building a water treatment plant would have cost. You can think about it in terms of creating no-take areas in the oceans, and then the realization that, in fact, if you took the pressure that way off the fish communities and the fish got to be older and larger, their fecundity went up exponentially, and you actually got fish spilling out of these no-take areas that improved the fishery take of the region, even though there were parts of it they couldn't get to.
Yeah. Obviously, none of us are escaping this idea, or none of us are escaping the impacts of COVID and the pandemic. And, I think the world is understanding that this is something we are going to have to live with for a while now. Very literally trillions of dollars are being spent or are proposed to be spent on jumpstarting the economy in various ways. What role do you think we ought to make sure that jumpstart plays in terms of taking care of nature? Are you worried that we're just going to, well, I know you're worried. You're worried that we're going to rebuild, because I'm worried too. We're going to try and rebuild the same stuff we had before, except take even more shortcuts, because now we're using the excuse, and it's a real excuse, that real people are out of jobs and, people are dying. How do one, what would you like to see done? And two, how do we best do it?
Yeah. So point number one is the pandemic actually was predicted and predictable, and it came from excessive intrusion on nature. And we can pursue that subject some other time, but those who have any background in epidemiology, which I happen to have, know that these kinds of things are likely to happen most any time, and that increasing that probability comes from basically intruding on nature and trafficking in wild animals and having wild animal markets.
At an unimaginable scale, in the middle of a city of 8 million people, that sort of thing.
That's right. So, so in any case, that's one part of it. But the opportunity to build back differently at a time when we're struggling to meet the sustainable development goals around the world is actually a godsend. And so actually thinking about more sustainable ways to build economies that will lower the risk of future pandemics, that will provide opportunities for nature to recover is essential. And there's one part of the benefits of biodiversity that never gets calculated, which is biodiversity is essentially a living library for the life sciences. And every species is out there every day inventing new solutions to particular biological problems that they face. And any one of those at any time can literally revolutionize the life sciences. So who would have said, that a virus has some value? Well, the cowpox virus led Dr. Jenner to figure out vaccination. I mean, just think of the hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who've lived longer and more productive lives because of that idea. Does biodiversity get any credit for those kinds of things? The people who treat their high blood pressure with the ACE inhibitors should be grateful to a nasty viper, the fer-de-lance, in the New World tropical forests. So if we could only start thinking about all that biological diversity as a source of knowledge and information on top of everything else, I think we could end up with a much better place. Societies value libraries, why not value the living library?
Absolutely. It's really well put. So I want to just shift slightly to another global crisis, and one that really is truly an existential crisis to humanity. This virus, like previous pandemics, we don't know exactly when, we don't know exactly how, we don't fully understand what that future world looks like, but we do understand that the world has seen other pandemics before in human memory, and that we have the tools that we need and potentially the mobilization to do that. There's another thing that's happening that hasn't really happened in really human memory, and that's climate change. And the overwhelming, challenge with it, in a lot of ways, there's equivalence to it. You need global action, you need personal responsibility, you need investment in science and technology, and you need to take action now and not wait in the future. And then the least who can afford it most will be hit the worst by it. Interestingly, you've been talking about biodiversity and conservation and climate change. Honestly, I think longer than really anyone I know has been. I knew you wrote a book or co-authored a book with Lee Hanna, who's a scientist at Conservation International. You edited it called on biodiversity and climate change in 2005. And more recently, you put this book out, I think maybe last year, called Biodiversity and Climate Change, which is sort of an update of that previous volume at the 10th or 12th year anniversary. Can you talk a little bit about biodiversity and climate change and what you see in terms of the challenges on climate change right now?
So of course, so you can see the fingerprints of biodiversity on climate change wherever you look. The reason there are muskoxen on that cover is not just because they catch attention. It's because they're a perfect example of how climate change will home in on some aspect of natural history that is hard to anticipate in advance. In this particular case, when caribou and musk oxen go to forage in winter, the females, instead of having snow to brush away to find the vegetation, run
Right.
into rain, and they're raising underweight calves. So the biology of the planet is actually quite sensitive to climate change, and we're already seeing major ecosystems fail. Tropical coral reefs and coral bleaching, the coniferous forests of Western North America tipped in favor of the native bark beetles. And so looking back and understanding how biodiversity responds to climate change geologically in time, at a certain point, ecosystems start coming apart. And that's what's happening with coral reefs. That's what's happening with those coniferous forests. And Lee and I agree that climate change greater than 1.5 degrees, there will be so much of that beginning to happen. It will be really hard to manage the planet biologically. And so the big challenge is, how can we end up with that soft landing at 1.5 degrees instead of considerably more, which is where we're already headed. And that's where nature-based solutions come in.
So let's talk for a minute about nature-based solutions, because it is one of the big bets that Conservation International is making. I think it is going to be a big part of our work. We've already been doing it for many years. We have some fantastic partners in companies like Apple and Tiffany's and Disney and P&G and others who have helped invest in nature-based solutions. What does it mean? What do you see as the upside on it, and what are the pitfalls?
So in the end, climate change actually is almost entirely biologically driven. The fossil fuels are just ancient ecosystems and ancient photosynthesis, sort of the energy and carbon being released in an instant, a geological instant. But most people are not aware of the substantial contribution to CO2 levels from the destruction of nature. And
sort of living carbon.
Yeah, so all life is made of carbon. So, you know, a tree dies and rots, and that all goes up into the atmosphere as CO2, or you burn it or whatever. So all life being built of carbon, when you restore ecosystems, they are pulling carbon back out of the atmosphere. And to give you a sense of scale, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere from destroyed terrestrial nature is essentially equal to what remains in extant terrestrial nature. Usually put out there in numbers, you know.
So wait, say that again. Please say that again.
The CO2 from destroyed terrestrial nature in the atmosphere is equal to the carbon that remains in standing terrestrial nature.
Wow.
Now, half of it is up in the atmosphere.
Right.
And if we stop burning fossil fuels right now and brought 1/3 of that carbon back through ecosystem restoration, we could end up back at 350 parts per million and a 1.5 degree soft landing. Or to put it another way, we cannot solve the climate change problem without nature-based solutions.
Wow. Right. We can't get to the targets that we have set for ourselves without also protecting nature.
That's right. And restoring.
Yeah, and restoring. So on that restoration side, so there's two quick things. I want to make sure we have time for questions, but very quickly, what do you think about this idea about planting trillion trees, et cetera? I mean, full disclosure, we are into restoration as well, and we do have commitments to reforest and replant certain forests. But what do you think of that idea about 1 trillion trees?
So if it was 1 trillion eucalyptus trees, it would not be a great idea. But if it's understood to be about restoring tree-dominated ecosystems, I think it's a fine thing. And there are two great things about all of this. One is it actually makes the point that the planet works as a linked biological and physical system, and therefore we should manage it that way. And the second thing is that this suddenly becomes something an individual can contribute to, right? By planting a tree or helping restore a coastal wetland. And so I find that latter, in fact, quite exciting because everybody can get out there and do something to make a difference.
Yes, it's one of the hardest questions I find I get when I give talks. I'm sure you do too, when people say, what can I do? And, you know, of course I'm saying, look, you know, help support Conservation International. We need the funding. But to some extent, I feel like I have to offer more. And being able to restore a place, restore a forest, plant a tree, those are very, very concrete steps that we can show the chain of causality from an individual action to a global good. My last question, Tom, because I'm on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., and you are as well. You know, given that the world is moving into what seems like a more nationalistic idea, that, you know, that even in Europe borders are closed, whether it's for national reasons or for health reasons, given the trends that you've seen in this country and around the world, given the upheaval in politics that you're seeing right now, incredible, you know, polarization of messaging. You've worked in both Republican and Democratic administrations. You've received an Order of Merit from the Brazilian government. So you really are a kind of a citizen of the world, and almost without party affiliation in the most global sense of it. What's the way forward? And do you really worry that we're going to lose our message in the infighting that we're seeing around the environment?
So it was really very unfortunate when certain political advisors raised the possibility of doing something negative about the environment as a positive campaign message, right? It all was about freedom of action, and it needs just to be flipped around. I'm going to have to let somebody in my front door for a minute. Just one second.
That's okay. It's the new world of of doing webinars online. You have interruptions. I did this in the office so that I don't have my 14-month-old interrupting me.
So, where am I lost?
No, you said, look, we took a little bit of a turn when we let the political messaging get hijacked by rolling back environmental action.
So I tell you what I really work hard at doing is just trying to be practical and matter of fact and not ideological. I mean, yes, I am a deep greenie, no question about it. But it's like when I go to Camp 41, I don't do a lot of talking. I basically let the experience do the communicating. And so that way I've been able to talk across political boundaries a lot. I would say, of course, today, it's really hard to do that. But I keep sort of biding my time and looking for my opportunity, and I think there may be really interesting things starting in the Amazon with the Leticia Pact led by Colombia that can sort of counterbalance some other things going on. So
The
I guess the
Letitia
bottom
Pact
line
is a group of Amazon country governments at the presidential level jointly agreeing to work together on conservation, right? To put it simply.
yes, yeah. So
Yeah.
I think the point is, if you keep your eyes and ears open, there will be always opportunities to make a difference.
Oh, great. Thank you. I think we can move to questions and just make sure that folks can send in questions and for Dr. Lovejoy.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sanjayan. Thank you, Dr. Lovejoy. We're going to try to get to as many questions as we can in the next 10 minutes. I have the first question, which is close to my heart. Here in California, keeping in mind fires in California and 2 hurricanes landing on shores soon, how do we prioritize the environment when we are in constant state of crisis response?
Well, of course, there's a major driver of climate change in all 3 of those. And I say that not because we should throw up our hands, we can't do anything about it. But it's also important to remember that what we're seeing right now could get worse if climate change gets worse. So, you know, the people who are affected by those events are going through terrible experiences right now. And they should not be thought of as natural disasters. They are a mix of human-driven and natural disasters.
Thank you.
Judy, I just want to add for folks who are interested in the work that we're doing around the world and on fires in particular, the Amazon, like last year, is back on fire again. And there are several hundred fires going on right now within the Amazon. We have a tool called Firecast, Firecast. If you go to conservation.org, you can find it, or if you just type Firecast and Conservation International, you'll find it. It's a real-time tool, so it will tell you right now where the fires are and the severity of the fires and how it's been monitored throughout the Amazon basin. A very powerful tool that allows us to get the information out to frontline responders and indigenous peoples who are connected through their cell network to receive information about the nearest fires.
Great, thank you. And that's sort of a nice segue to the next question, which is about tree planting. This participant would really like you to follow up on the idea of planting trees. There's not enough attention to planting the right trees in the right places. And how can we make sure that's widely understood? They say sorry, but I got to scroll down a little bit. I could foresee a lot of well-intended but misguided planting initiatives that could do more harm than good.
So I think that's a very important point. Details are really, really important as to what you do about this and where. As Ed Wilson once said, God is in the details.
Fair enough.
All right. For the next question is coming. Sorry, I'm just waiting.
But while you're doing that, that was a very funny story. It was a meeting in the West, Roosevelt Room in the West Wing, with Bush's chief of staff, his science advisor, and me and Ed Wilson to talk about the Endangered Species Act. And when the chief of staff realized that Ed thought all species should be saved, that was the end of the conversation. And, you know, his throwaway remark at the end was, well, I suppose the devil is in the details. No, sir, said Professor Wilson. God is in the details.
I love that. Great.
Very nice.
All right, I will note for folks that we have put the Firecast link in the chat, so you can look at that anytime. The next question is, can listeners nominate individuals for Dr. Lovejoy to invite to Camp 41. They have a few not to be named world leaders in mind.
Well, I mean, the answer is yes. I can't wait to be able to take people there. And Sanjayan's really at the top of that list. So, of course, I love taking people there.
There's a wonderful YouTube video of a bunch of young people, and they look like high school students who came to Camp 41. And they obviously made the video itself, because I guarantee you the quality and the music is beyond your capability and mine. But it's a lovely little glimpse into Camp 41 from the eyes of I think what I would imagine would be a teenage eyes.
Actually, college students.
Were they?
Yeah.
Wow, I'm getting older.
But it was very well done.
Of course.
Their total, I didn't have a word to say about how it was done, or even if it was going to be done. That was their creation.
Great.
Okay, we're queuing up the last question on the way. Tom, while we're waiting, that is a spectacular space you're in. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
So this is the oldest house in McLean, Virginia. It dates to 1730. There were only 2 rooms on the ground floor. This is one of them. And it served a little toll road right here, about 8 feet away, which farmers used to bring their animals from market to market from the Shenandoah Valley.
Spectacular. Well, I have to say, I probably spoke for many who were just intrigued by your surroundings. Let's see. And so this is our last question. Folks would like to know, what are 1 or 2 actions that people on this call can take away and incorporate into their own lives? I'll give that to
I would think first and foremost, without becoming a total bore, is talk about this, write about this in accessible ways so that the message gets spread. And it's a message, not only of warning about the ways we're headed, but that in fact there are solutions. And we should embrace those and move forward.
Can I do so? Can I take a stab at that one too? So look, you got to vote, and you got to get the mailbox early and stand in line at the post office or wherever you need to do that. So you have to vote. It's a real privilege. The first time I was able to vote was in America as an American citizen. It's a big moment, because in the country that I grew up in and the country that I was from, you don't get to do that. And you certainly don't get to do that and leave unharmed. Personal thing, my big thing has been food. Been very conscious about the food we eat and what we drink and the quantity and the waste. Most of the coffee, the biggest coffee drinker in my household is my sink, because you make a big pot of coffee, you only use a little bit and the rest goes down the sink. The cost of heating that water is enormous compared to everything else that goes into that, from packaging to bringing those beans out there. It's what's called this scope 3 emissions, right? We are putting a lot of pressure on companies to change their acts, and they are. Believe me, they're responding. The good ones are responding. They're using this moment to accelerate beyond the bad ones. The problem is that the vast amount of those emissions actually falls into our scope of responsibility. So when P&G or Unilever make a product that says you can wash your laundry in cold water, but I'm hitting hot, it kind of negates the point. So the biggest piece of this puzzle is what you're eating and how much you're eating and what you're wasting. So learn about your diet and try to make those changes there. Trees, I agree completely. get involved in reforestation or protecting trees. It's a direct link you can make. We have some platforms to do that, but there's plenty of others. And then explore the world, ideally in partnership with a great organization that you know of. It could be the World Wildlife Fund, it could be Conservation International, it could be the Nature Conservancy, it could be a local land trust, but don't sit it out. Please explore with an organization that you know about or you want to learn more about.
Fantastic. That's a great note to end on. Thank you. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Really want to thank Dr. Lovejoy for his always inspiring insights. I particularly love the nature is the living library. I hope you don't mind if I use that. I also want to let participants know we'll be following up with an email. It'll include a link to the video, and it'll also include a survey. We'd really appreciate your inputs on any ways we can improve what we're doing and what you liked. We'd also love you to share the video with family and friends. Finally, I'd love to share that our next installment of People Need Nature is on Thursday, September 3rd, 1 p.m. Eastern. It'll be focused on what Indigenous wisdom teaches us about climate change. So hugely important and very relevant to this conversation. And our speaker will be Hindu Umaru Ibrahim, and she is an Indigenous leader and a CI board member. So we really hope you can join us for that. Thanks so much, everyone.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Take care. Bye, Judy. Stay safe.
Take care. You too.
Thank you, everyone.